B. Collins.
Let me be clear. Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, June 13th, 2019. Yesterday at George Washington University, the Brooklyn-born, independent U.S. Senator from Vermont gave a pretty strong speech defining his brand of democratic socialism. And I think the timing is excellent, although I could have stood to hear this a while back from Bernie Sanders. But he gave a speech where he took on those who try to denigrate socialism, make it seem like the most evil system the world has ever devised. And pundits on CNN said that, can he make the case in a 2-hour speech when Donald Trump is somebody who speaks in 1 or 2 sentence sound bites? Well, Bernie was brief. His speech was only 45 minutes. And I'm working from an account here by Kevin Gostola. Sanders attacked Trump by flipping the script and hit Trump for supporting socialism for corporations and the 1%, while opposing policies and programs that could lift up poor and working-class people. Quote, if you're the Trump family, you got $885 million worth of tax breaks and subsidies for your family's housing empire that's built on racial discrimination. When Trump screams socialism, all of his hypocrisy will not be lost on the American people. Americans will know that he's attacking all that we take for granted, from Social Security to Medicare to veterans' health care to roads and bridges, public schools, national parks, clean water, and clean air. I'm reminded of what Dr. Martin Luther King said. This country has socialism for the rich, rugged individualism for the poor. And that is the difference between Donald Trump and me. He believes in corporate socialism for the rich and powerful. I believe in a democratic socialism that works for the working families of this country. And he essentially articulated or outlined an economic Bill of Rights. He said, I do understand that I and other progressives will face massive attacks from those who attempt to use the word socialism as a slur. But I should also tell you that I have faced and overcome these attacks for decades. And I'm not the only one. He goes back in time and cites Harry Truman, president in the late 1940s, early 50s. Socialism is the epithet they have hurled at every advance the people have made in the last 20 years. Socialism is what they call Social Security. It's what they call farm price supports. It's what they call bank deposit insurance. Socialism is what they called the growth of free and independent labor organizations. Socialism is their name for almost anything that helps all the people. And then he went into a kind of call and response. I don't know that the audience responded. But he asked a series of questions. What does it actually mean to be free? Are you truly free if you're unable to go to a doctor when you're sick or face financial bankruptcy when you leave the hospital? Are you truly free if you can't afford the prescription drug you need to stay alive? Are you truly free when you spend half of your limited income on housing? Are you truly free if you're 70 years old and forced to work because you lack a pension or enough money to retire? And the litany continued, concluding with, are you truly free if you're a veteran who put your life on the line to defend this country and now sleep out on the streets? To me, the answer to those questions in the wealthiest nation on earth is no. You are not free. And Gostola winds up his piece by saying the Sanders campaign recognizes that if Trump wants to talk about handouts to the so-called freeloaders at the bottom of society, they must force Trump to confront the rampant freeloading among wealthy people and the heads of powerful corporations. He bets voters will be more offended by their conduct than the conduct of poor and working-class people who depend on the few social safety net programs available to them in order to survive. Now, for an analysis that is from a more pure, if you will, socialist perspective, there's a great piece published today under the byline of Megan Day at Jacobin Mag. And Jacobin is a left-leaning publication. And she opens by saying that economist Joe Stiglitz had warned that this term democratic socialism is so loaded that people like Sanders or AOC should shift to a euphemism like progressive capitalism. But Bernie doesn't go that route, and he called it as he sees it. He defines basic economic rights as the right to quality health care, as much education as one needs to succeed, the right to a good job that pays a living wage, right to affordable housing, a secure retirement, and to live in a clean environment. And he called these demands a 21st century economic Bill of Rights. Today, we now see a handful of billionaires with unprecedented wealth and power, he said. We see huge private monopolies operating outside of any real democratic oversight and often subsidized by taxpayers with the power to control almost every aspect of our lives. They are the profit-taking gatekeepers of our healthcare, technology, finance system, food supply, and almost all of the other basic necessities of life. And here's where Bernie said, "Let me be absolutely clear." He loves that. Democratic socialism, to me, requires achieving political and economic freedom in every community. And let me also be clear, the only way we achieve those goals is through a political revolution, where millions of people get involved and take on the powerful corporate interests whose greed is destroying the social and economic fabric of our country. Now, the author here, Megan Day, does quibble a little bit about the use of the term socialism and feels that it might muddy the true definition. But when you see how capitalism extracts profits while socializing liabilities, socializing costs, I'm not so concerned about the pure definition of the term socialism. And those who believe that it's the system that we should use in this country, I don't denounce you or quibble with you, but I accept that capitalism is the dominant system and that I believe socialist tendencies or leanings can help reduce the excessive negative impacts of capitalism. If you can put a socialist movement together and win the day, I'll submit. But I believe that we are so hooked on profits and capitalism that it would be hard to really separate the United States from that deep history. A new analysis of the Iowa polls suggests that Joe Biden is in trouble, partly because of the huge field of challengers in the 2020 Democratic primaries. He has high name recognition, and he has a bigger lead nationally than he does in the state of Iowa. And because those caucuses lean toward more liberal, progressive, and often new faces, his 5-point lead in Iowa is very weak compared to his 16-point lead nationally. And with the Iowa caucuses having predicted the winner of the last competitive 4 presidential elections, and at least on the Democratic side, and in looking at the pattern of Iowa, New Hampshire, and then the expanded Super Tuesday with California having an early primary next year, it does put Biden into a tough situation. And I think that it kind of takes the bloom off the rose of many moderates who see him as the savior of the corporate Democratic Party. So yesterday, the Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, arrived in Iran, and he met with President Rouhani, and also with the Ayatollah, the supreme leader. And this was a high-level effort to de-escalate the crisis that the U.S. has started by withdrawing from the Iranian nuclear deal and imposing very tough sanctions on Iran. And what's really curious is while Abe was in Tehran, there was another incident involving tankers in the Gulf of Oman. And 2 ships, both carrying freight that was said to be headed for Japan ultimately. One ship is on fire, and both of them were abandoned by their crews. We're told that they were hit by either a torpedo or they ran into a mine in the water. Now, this is highly suspicious. This appears to be a scripted narrative, if you ask me. And because it was just a couple of weeks ago that John Bolton was screaming bloody murder because of alleged incidents involving 4 tankers in the Gulf of Oman, all of this is being blamed on Iran. And, of course, I remain highly skeptical. Show me evidence, John Bolton, and I'll accept it. But this is another evidence-free episode where they're trying to gin up leverage against Iran by painting it as a rogue nation that is resorting to these, kind of mysterious attacks to try to score points against the United States. And I'm not yet ready to call it a false flag because we simply don't have enough information. But that is certainly my leading theory at this point. To stage this at a moment when the Japanese Prime Minister is there trying to reduce tensions? By the way, Abe brought a letter from Trump to deliver to Ayatollah Khomeini, and the Ayatollah wouldn't even open it. I do not see Trump as worthy of any message exchange, and I do not have any reply for him now or in the future. And I think that Trump has miscalculated badly here by listening to people like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. And there are perhaps other hawkish voices on his National Security Council. He's also listening to Bibi Netanyahu, who wants us to do the dirty work that Israel has hoped for so long, and attack Iran in a way that would set back its military development by 10 or 20 years. But Iran is a nation of 80 million people with a strong standing army, and the Persian culture there is one that I have deep respect for. They will not roll over. And I think Trump is making some serious miscalculations here. Now, if John Kiriakou's report is true that Bolton may be booted out of the administration at any moment, that could be encouraging. But as I said yesterday, who knows who his replacement might be. And my email is already filling up with right-wing nuts. Here's an offer to interview Dan Perkins, the nationally recognized expert on foreign policy and energy, a contributor to Daily Caller, Newsmax, and The Hill. And he buys into Mike Pompeo's characterization. This is a blatant assault by Iran. Pompeo is quoted here in this news release. This assessment is based on intelligence, the weapons used, the level of expertise needed to execute the operation, recent similar Iranian attacks on shipping that are unproven, and the fact that no proxy group operating in the area has the resources to act with such a high degree of sophistication. What about the CIA? Do they operate with a high degree of sophistication? I mentioned Kevin Gostola's report on the Bernie speech. That appeared at Medium, and by the way, I have a link to it if you'd like to read it in the show file for today's podcast. Gostola also pushed out an article yesterday based on a report by Brown University's Costs of War project. And our regime change wars, our so-called war on terror, has spewed over 1 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases since 2001. It's the equivalent to the annual emissions of 250 million passenger cars, more than double the current number of cars on the road in the U.S. In 2017 alone, the Pentagon's greenhouse gas emissions were about 59 million metric tons. That's more than Finland, Sweden, or Denmark. At least 400 million metric tons of greenhouse gases are a result of consumption in war zones in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. I have 2 accounts for you of the ongoing protests that have gone violent in Hong Kong. The first is from the AP. Quote, following a day of sit-ins, tear gas, and clashes with police, Hong Kong students and civil rights activists vowed to keep protesting a proposed extradition bill. Quote, we'll stay until the government drops this law. and Xi Jinping gives up on trying to turn Hong Kong into just another city in China like Beijing and Shanghai. Now, on the face, this is scrappy people in Hong Kong fighting for what limited rights they still have left, and fearful of an extradition law that could lead people to be sent from Hong Kong to the mainland to face trial. But there is a different perspective, and I found it at Mint Press News today under the byline of Alexander Rubinstein. And Rubinstein points out that the American Regime Change Agency, the National Endowment for Democracy, is pretty active. And some of the groups involved in the Hong Kong protests have received significant funding from NED. But the article shows that an American journalist who works in China told Mint Press News, "It's unfortunate there's been all this hullabaloo over what is a fairly routine and reasonable adjustment to the law. As the law reads right now, there's no legal way to prevent criminals in other parts of China from escaping charges by fleeing to Hong Kong." And they cite the case of a man who is wanted for a murder in Taiwan who is hiding out in Hong Kong. And they say that some 70 non-governmental organizations have endorsed an open letter urging for the bill to be killed. But it's signed by only 3 directors of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Hong Kong Human Rights Monitor. Then we learn that the Human Rights Monitor has received, $90,000 from the National Endowment for Democracy, and apparently other money may have flowed to them as well. So I don't find this definitive, but I find it interesting, and it is the kind of reporting that I appreciate from Mint Press, offering us real alternatives to the corporate mainstream media. Protests continued in Moscow yesterday as people object to what they call police fabrication in the arrest of an investigative journalist. They picked him up on drug charges that were dropped, and he had dared them to test him for the drugs that he said were planted on him by the cops. This is Ivan Golanov, and he remains free at this time, but the political protests continue in Moscow. I want to recommend a piece at the Gray Zone Project today, this one under the byline of Alex Rubinstein. And I just made the connection, but I'm guessing he's the same Alexander Rubinstein that I just quoted from at Mint Press. His article is about the protests in Honduras in recent weeks. The National Police had fanned out through the country to crush protests with heavy-handed tactics at the direction of President Juan Orlando Hernandez, the U.S.-supported neoliberal leader who won power in elections marred by documented fraud. And as part of the protest, a fire was set to the doors of the American embassy in the capital of Tegucigalpa. And it takes us back to the Obama administration when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State and Manuel Zelaya was hustled out of Honduras. In a military raid supported by the United States, he wound up in Costa Rica where he said he'd been kidnapped, and Hillary Clinton went to some lengths to keep him out of the country. There's no indication that our State Department was active in the coup, but once he was eased out, we made sure that he couldn't return so that this fellow, Juan Orlando Hernandez, would be able to take power. So in early May, the International Monetary Fund and the Honduran government reached an agreement on a $300 million loan, and the reforms that are imposed by the IMF include higher electricity rates and cuts to education, a massive cut to education, and a 20% cut to health care. And this is the most poor country, the highest poverty rate in the continental Americas. 65% are considered in poverty, with 42% in extreme poverty. And with fuel prices going up, electricity costing more, this has led to a true crisis. And this is one of the factors that drives people to leave Honduras and try to make it to the United States. Every day I pause for a minute to greet people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast. I often make a pitch for subscriptions here, but we are observing the 10th anniversary of the Peter B. Collins Podcast this week, and I've been hearing from a lot of great listeners scattered all across the United States and around the world. And here is Theodore, but call me Pat, Kelly, who says, I've been a supporter for a while now, $10 a month, and I'm amazed at how in line my way of thinking about our situation is with yours. Well, thank you, Pat. I do appreciate that. Let's see who else checked in here. Jeff Silverman. Found your podcast from a chat link in Common Dreams about 6 months ago. Word of mouth, so to say. I listen 3 to 4 times a week, time permitting. Don't change a thing. And that is Jeff from Marysville in Washington State. And let's do one more here. Julie Dupree. Congratulations on 10 years. I began listening to you when you were on KRXA. I had a job that required lots of driving. I also remembered you from earlier AM Talk Radio. That would be here in San Francisco. I've lived in Hollister, California since 1985. And by the way, that's not the same Hollister that's on all those T-shirts you see all over the place. That's a surf town in Southern California. Anyway, she grew up in the Bay Area. She shared my podcast with many people. Julie, thank you for your comments. And by the way, if you're not currently a subscriber, you can fix that. All you got to do is drop by peterbcollins.com, click on menu, click on Become a Subscriber. When you hit the sign-up page, you choose the level of support that's good for you. And if you're allergic to PayPal, we understand, you can send a one-time contribution or a payment for a subscription to Box 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Yesterday, Julian Assange got a visit from his father and from Ai Weiwei, a man who, as you know, I have great respect and admiration for. He is the Chinese dissident activist, artist, filmmaker, and just amazing all-around guy. And they report that Julian's health has declined. He has been in the hospital wing of the Belmarsh prison. And tomorrow he's scheduled for a hearing. It's not clear if they'll take him to a courtroom or hold the hearing by video or exactly what. But it follows the sign-off by Britain's Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, on the extradition request from the U.S. That was finalized and sent over, and it will be part of a hearing that is scheduled for Friday. And this is part of a lengthy process. Certainly, any hearings will be scheduled in a couple of months, and there will be likely appeals of the extradition order that is expected to be granted by British courts. Here in the U.S., the Democratic-led House Intelligence Committee issued 2 new subpoenas today demanding that Michael Flynn, the former national security advisor, and Rick Gates, who was a top Trump campaign aide and a partner in Paul Manafort's firm, be required to testify and provide documents. Now, they have withheld a positive response to the subpoenas that were issued because they've been ordered by the White House not to cooperate. So Adam Schiff, taking a break from his almost constant appearances on MSDNC, said that these are necessary because Flynn and Gates have refused to fully cooperate with the committee. Schiff said there was a waterfront of topics we're concerned about with Flynn. Now, one of the things he wants to talk to Flynn about is his lobbying work for the Turkish government. And I'm very interested in hearing about that because Bob Mueller just kind of glossed over it and said, no biggie. I think it was a much bigger deal than the conversations with the Russian ambassador that Flynn subsequently lied about. And the New York Times continuing to promote the Russiagate narrative. Notes that Gates also worked with Manafort to transfer political polling data to a business associate tied to Russian intelligence, Mr. Mueller found. That would be Konstantin Kilimnik, and Mueller failed to report his long-running work as an asset of the State Department in painting him as a tool of Russian intelligence. Does that make him a double agent? I don't know. Also, the Oversight Committee in the House, run by Elijah Cummings, has voted 24-15 to advance contempt measures against the Attorney General, Bill Barr, and the Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross, over the demand for documents and testimony related to the efforts to add a citizenship question to the census in 2020. And we know that whole issue has been blown open by the revelation of the gerrymandering guru who wrote information that was used by the Justice Department in false legal arguments about the census question. And any day now, between now and the end of June, the Supreme Court will rule on the census question. And what we don't know is if they will use the latest available evidence to guide their decision. Ray McGovern is back writing at consortiumnews.com. And I have to say, I love Ray, but he has more faith in the Barr Justice Department and its investigators than I do. The headline reads, DOJ bloodhounds on the scent of John Brennan. Now, I agree with Ray that John Brennan, James Clapper, and James Comey are the likely scriptwriters for the Trump-Russia narrative. And here is where I think that Ray has too much confidence in the politicized Justice Department. He says, with their investigators' noses to the ground, it should just be a matter of time before they identify Brennan conclusively as fabricator-in-chief of the Russiagate story. Evidence, real evidence in this case, abounds, since the Brennan, Comey, Clapper gang of three were sure Hillary Clinton would become president. Consequently, they did not perform due diligence to hide their tracks. And he points out that Barr has appointed the U.S. Attorney in Connecticut, John Durham, to run the investigation of the Mueller investigation. And as you know, I welcome an honest investigation of Mueller, but John Durham has a really mixed record. Now, to his credit, he was handed the case of Whitey Bulger, and he exposed FBI misdeeds, and it led to a settlement of $100 million against the FBI. But more recently, he was handed the case of the CIA torture tape destruction, and he found no basis to pursue charges. That, I believe, was a cover-up. So I don't have the same confidence that Ray does in the people who are being assigned to run this investigation. And that same great organization, the FBI, now the subject of a new Inspector General's report, that they lost track of 62 foreign nationals that the agency had sponsored for travel into the United States to help them with investigations. And they failed to report at least 24 of these absconsions to immigration officials. Now, we don't know who these people are, whether they were brought in to work as double agents or as undercover operatives in some of the setup, the frame-up operations the FBI runs. But this is just another example of bad behavior by what I call the rogue agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Yesterday, U.S. Marshals were serving a warrant on a suspect near Memphis, and they say he rammed his vehicle into the officers' cars multiple times before exiting with a weapon, so they shot and killed him. I can't vouch for the story that the marshals are telling. It may be 100% true, but often police lie in situations like this. So about 24 cops were injured, and this is misdirected anger on the part of the citizens of Memphis because it was a federal marshal team that conducted this raid, but it is Memphis cops who got the brunt of people's anger. And closer to home here in Vallejo, California, it's just about 20 miles away from me, Willie McCoy, who was killed on the 9th of February while he sat in his car snoozing in the drive-through lane at a Taco Bell. He was shot and killed by officers who managed to fire off 55 bullets in 3.5 seconds. And we only know this because an expert, David Blake, a retired cop who was hired to exonerate these bad cops, said, well, this killing was in line with contemporary training and police practices associated with the use of deadly force. 55 rounds fired by 6 officers in 3.5 seconds is reasonable? Now, Willie McCoy, a rapper, was sitting in his car. He had passed out or was asleep. Maybe he was drugged. Maybe he was drunk. He did have a gun on his lap. But the body cam videos show that the cops had discussed that. They knew that he had a gun, but it didn't have a clip in it. So, at worst, he would be able to fire one shot. And apparently, while sleeping or conked out, McCoy moved his hand to scratch his head. And that was the move that police used to base their 55 bullets, a barrage that occurred in 3.5 seconds. And this so-called expert Blake defended the high volume of bullets. He said, cops are generally trained to fire until the threat has been neutralized, and they probably continue to fire due in part to acute stress and chaos caused by the sounds of gunfire, debris, and weapons. They created that chaos. So frustrating. So frustrating. Yesterday, Trump gave an interview to George Stephanopoulos of ABC News. You may have seen it. He basically said that if the Russiagate deal repeated itself and if Russians came to Trump Tower and offered information on his political opponent, that he would take it. It's a dumb thing for Trump to say. And the Democrats have pounced. Nancy Pelosi, the president, gave us evidence once again he does not know right from wrong. It's a very sad thing. Everybody in the country should be totally appalled. Chuck Schumer, disgraceful, shocking. It's as if the president had learned absolutely nothing in the past 2 years. I agree with both of those comments. But the Republicans can fire back and point at Christopher Steele, the British guy hired to dig for dirt in Russia, on Trump. And so one hypocrite takes on another. And at the Washington Post, Aaron Blake points out that Trump lied when he told ABC News, I don't think in my whole life I've ever called the FBI. Well, he has. and Blake is specific. This goes back to when Trump was getting involved in the casino game in New Jersey back in the early 1980s. And Trump was working with an FBI agent named Walt Stone. They played golf together, hung out a little bit. And then when Trump was challenged by the director of New Jersey's Division of Gaming Enforcement, he said, I'm working with the FBI. Kellyanne Conway is in hot water, but it won't matter. Trump will, he'll put some ice cubes in it. The Office of Special Counsel, which is a different Justice Department office from Bob Mueller, totally different, has found a pattern of misbehavior by Kellyanne Conway. As she dispenses alternate facts, she has also violated the Hatch Act on multiple occasions by attacking political opponents. And, as I said, Trump will just ignore it and it will go away. And I almost never talk about professional sports on this podcast because I don't care about professional sports. But I do get infected during NBA playoffs when the Golden State Warriors are in the fray. And tonight will be the last game in Oakland at the so-called Oracle Arena, the Oakland Alameda County Coliseum complex. The Warriors are moving across the bay to San Francisco next year. And sure, I deplore the money. I mean, these are millionaires who go and run up and down a court so they can make even more money. And it was disgusting when one of the owners of the Warriors grabbed Kyle Lowry of the Toronto Raptors and told him to go F himself. This billionaire, who has a small stake in the Warriors, Mark Stevens, was fined $500,000. And that just shows I mean, he paid $92,000 for a courtside seat for one game. That's pretty disgusting. But go Warriors. I hope that the struggling team with all those injured players can pull out a rabbit from a hat. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.